So I will go straight on to say welcome to Jay Kirk.
Thank you.
Here on my left. He's a writer, teaches at Penn in the English department there, specializes in creative nonfiction for magazines such as Harper's, GQ, New York Times Magazine, so on, but also this wonderful book, which is what we're actually going to talk mostly about tonight, Kingdom of Glass. It's published in 2010, I think.
That sounds right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
And it's also, isn't it, like took 6 years of my life. It kind of took me away from everything else.
For 6 years? I'm not surprised. Yeah. The research, I want to ask about that, but it seems as though it would take 6 years, if not more. But yeah, so I'm gonna kick off with a few questions, but one thing I wanted to ask about, just sort of straight off the bat, was to understand the importance of Carl Akeley. He's called the father of taxidermy, or history's greatest taxidermist. So I was curious about the Akeley method and his innovations in sort of the state of taxidermy prior, what he invented, and particularly given your research, what has changed today? It's a big, broad question.
Wow, okay. Yeah, I mean, I was only throwing that out there like the 6 years just because I feel like it took me away from when you were saying I wrote for such and such magazines, and it's been so long since I've actually had a chance to do anything other than work on this book. So, you want me to start with the Akeley method? Like his actual revolution, the way he revolutionized the art form itself?
Yeah, an overview of it. There's an overview of it.
An overview,
yeah.
When Carl Akeley started doing taxidermy, he was a really young man. He was 11 or 12 years old. He was doing it in his parents' house, in his bedroom. And this was a point actually when it's like, the mid 1870s. And actually a lot of naturalists, a lot of budding naturalists were doing this. I mean, there were, Teddy Roosevelt was doing it. It was just basic preliminary background to becoming a naturalist. You had to know how to do taxidermy because this was the preliminary way of creating images, of collecting the specimens. The photography was still in its infancy, etc. So he's like 12 years old and he's skinning everything he can get his hands on. He's going around the corner to Bishop's drugstore in Clarendon, New York, which is like not a suburb, but a rural area about 20 miles outside of Rochester. And he's buying phenol and strychnine and arsenic, and his house, his bedroom is just covered with the corpses of animals in various stages of arrangement and disarrangement. And his parents are cool with this, but he has like an aunt who's very disturbed by it and tries to persuade his mom to have him institutionalized, like put into the local like mental asylum because she thought it was. I mean, and we didn't have serial killers then, or it wasn't identified as such, but that seemed to be the vibe that the aunt felt like this kid is bad news. But fortunately, in his teens, he got a job as a decorator, doing interior decoration, which had become a really fashionable thing for the sort of well-heeled middle-class folks. And so he's working in Rockport, New York, for an interior designer who's doing natural, kind of nature murals and a little bit of taxidermy and stuff like that. This is when the curiosity cabinets have become a real rage, and but the kind of reasoning behind that, or the idea behind it at that time, was still this kind of Victorian religious natural. It's called natural theology, or that's how we kind of classify it in retrospect. Is that by looking at the works of God, we would be able to see, the divine watchmaker. So that's what he's doing, and then he quickly moves on from there. He's not very good at painting. His only forte is taxidermy. So he moved on. He's very lucky. It was like good. It was just he was at the right place in the right time. And there was an establishment called Ward's Natural History Establishment. I think that's what it's called, in Rochester. And this is basically an emporium and kind of a training ground, kind of the Ivy League for budding naturalists for these natural history museums that are popping up all around the country all of a sudden. And Ward's is run by this rather august man named Augustus Ward. And he's basically the singular supplier for all of the natural history museums now. I mean, he's providing glyptodon skulls and meteorites and taxidermy and mounts and butterflies and fossils and all this stuff. And he has collecting agents all over the world collecting this stuff. Akeley quickly becomes one of the best taxidermists, but then he's also quickly fired because once he got there, he was kind of like frustrated with the lack of artistry of the taxidermy that was being performed. So they hadn't really moved on past like what they'd always done, which is like stuffing animals, you know. So they'd get the skins from explorers, people who had been abroad, and they would get these skins kind of secondhand. So they hadn't really been, that's important to point out, just because they hadn't been observed in the wild. And so Akeley, yeah, I mean, they were literally stuffing them with, you know, sawdust, rags, whatever they had around the studio. And he was pretty frustrated with the state of things, and he began to try to advance it by studying anatomy textbooks and trying to understand the animals better. And he wanted something new. He wanted to come up with something new. But he spent so much time and in his off hours in the middle of the night trying to practice removing the skins from the animals in more deliberate, careful ways, that he ended up getting fired because he was sleeping on the job and he wasn't really accomplishing that much. And so he had...
How old is he at this point? How old is he at this point?
He's like 19. He's a very, very young man.
When did Audubon's portfolio come out? Around the same time or earlier?
Audubon's a little later.
Later.
Audubon's like in the 1890s, I believe. Let's see, am I rambling?
Well, no, but I think what's interesting about that is that, you know, taxidermy at that time was, like you say, like not based on observation, and also just sort of a thing where they kind of stuffed the skin. And one thing I was curious about, you know, Akeley gets this reputation as the father of taxidermy, and I think, but he develops his technique quite early on. He has some lucky breaks. I like, there's an amazing scene where he stuffs Jumbo the elephant, P.T. Barnum's, you know, massive megastar elephant that gets run over by a train, and it's kind of an amazing scene. But then, but Akeley gets a sort of lucky break working in a museum in Milwaukee, and that's right where he makes a lot of his major innovations.
That's a great point. I mean, that's kind of how the artistic developments that Akeley is making kind of go along with some of the the revolutionary scientific ideas. So one of his only friends really was this guy named William Morton Wheeler, and Wheeler was just this very precocious, brilliant young scientist who also worked at Ward's. He was a coleopterist, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, like a beetle specialist. He was sort of the Edward O. Wilson of his time. and just, he studied insect embryology and stuff like this. And he was an individual who actually popularized the term ecology, which was definitely like a new, brand new concept. Akeley was more of just like a very hands-on artistic guy. He was not that theoretical, he wasn't academic, he wasn't that intellectual. He was an artistic genius. But his best friend is kind of inculcating him with all of these ideas about ecology, etc. This idea that that there's an interdependence, an interrelationship between the organism and its habitat. And so before that, at least in the dioramas, you would have, the natural history museums, and you can still see it if you go to some of the old ones, like in London. You just, these Victorian natural history museums, you have like a long row, a long row of just decapitated bird heads, with the Latin moniker, the Linnaean term, with maybe like the location of its execution. It's not very enlightening, but it's what they were doing. So, or a monkey paw nailed to the wall, or a bunch of heads. It's like, they just kind of glorified trophy rooms. And this was what natural history used to be, pre-ecology. And so his buddy, who he'd actually moved in with in Milwaukee, like after they graduated in this jumbo business, they moved to Milwaukee to live with William Morton Wheeler's mom and a studio. She gave them the studio space, and they would sit around, and Akeley would like work on his taxidermy, and his friend would just read to him, just like try to educate him. So Akeley's real, his first real revolution, or I don't know if it's his first revolution, but one of his major contributions is the idea of the habitat diorama. Not just the diorama, but the habitat diorama. So he actually incorporates the idea of not just the animal in a vacuum, but the idea of its habitat around it, which is very revolutionary. And he kind of demonstrates this in his dioramas. So his first sort of manifestation of this was when he was working at the Milwaukee Public Museum with his friend Wheeler. They're both in their like early 20s, and Wheeler is the director of this whole natural history museum. And Akeley gets all overly caffeinated on this idea of ecology, and he decides that he's going to go and create habitat dioramas for every single species of mammal in Wisconsin. And so he sets out to do this, and then and events turn against him, and he gets as far as doing a muskrat. And the rest of the Wisconsin mammalia, like, but that's his first kind of megalomaniacal vision, like I'm gonna do this. It's a very encyclopedic mentality, and but this is what he eventually does with the American Museum of Natural History. He transfers it to the continent of Africa.
I think it's a curious thing too, because on the one hand you have this idea of nature, ecology starting to find its way into museum display through Akeley, but then you also have this other idea that Akeley sort of embodies of being able to add this sort of completionist collection ethic that he has, which feels very much like the old vision of nature, something that humans were masters of. Like you could collect it all.
Like the Linnaean concept of collect, catalog, and just this comprehensive tendency towards acquisition.
Exactly.
Just everything. Yeah, completionist. That's an interesting term. It is like that.
Does the wall on the head signify that? The old, like kill your stag, put him on a board and hang it on your wall. Is that the more than acquiring, or is that like where does that fit in terms of the taxidermy chronology?
Plenty of people still do that. In my opinion, it's just kind of an inquisitive macho thing to do.
Yeah. No, but was it still going on way back when?
Yeah. No, I mean, when you see like a lot of the early natural history museums, that's kind of the extent of what they are doing. You know, and a lot of the, you know, head plus body work that's being done is just, you can't even recognize what the animal is. It's so bad. Because like the, you know, the taxidermists aren't, this is horrible, I'm like trying to admit this now, like ethology, you know, the science of going and observing animals in their natural habitat. They hadn't done that before, you know, so much. So there's this kind of interesting, I don't know what the correct term for it is, but just kind of facsimile distortion, like where you would go from the original. So maybe an explorer is in Africa and he sees a gerontic. He's like, wow, this is an extraordinary animal. And then he brings it back and he makes some bad sketches of it. He gets the dimensions wrong, and then he gets it all the way back to Rochester and he's like, here, stuff this. And then by the time they stuff it, you know, it looks like a weird Siamese cat with horns. Or, I mean, it doesn't resemble the actual animal in nature. So that, you know, that's another thing that Akeley sort of pioneered when he ended up at the Field Museum in Chicago.
Would he get the whole body or just the skin?
Yeah, oh, he would get the skin and the bones.
The skin and the bones?
Yeah, so mechanically, when they're creating the mannequin, or the armature, they would have the skin. This is so gruesome and gory. They would get the skin and then build it up around a pedestal, which is the armature, which they would kind of, like a wooden block, which they would then attach the...
Like milliners.
So, well, he worked in the millinery field, which is interesting. He did, with the birds on the hats, and yeah, that's some pretty fun stuff.
There's a crazy scenes where of the I guess there was a craze when he was a young man of birds in hats, but just, I mean, nests, eggs, entire birds in people's hats.
Tableau of birds assembled to look like a choir on the bridge.
on a hat.
Yeah. That led directly to the Audubon Society. That's how the Audubon Society came about, because a group of women in Boston decided maybe that wasn't the most moral thing.
So he'd have a block and then...
Yeah, so you'd have a wooden block and then attach the leg bones to it and then the skull on an iron post, and then they would rough out the dimensions of the animal around this basic armature using kind of like a small gauge wire mesh, and then they would build around that using, you know, clay or whatever. And so Akeley used, this is when he sort of revolutionizes the method. He really discovers himself as a sculptor. I mean, and he really sees himself as being a fine artist and a sculptor. So they'd always had, you know, like buckets of clay around the studio that he would use to rough out some of these armatures, but Akeley kind of had it doesn't seem like that wild an inspiration, but this was his inspiration. Well, he was actually working on an orangutan, and you know, he had this dissatisfaction was fairly constant for him. And then he's working on this orangutan, and he had this kind of eureka moment where he spent all night sculpting, you know? And he was working with a lot of measurements that he had.
So the skin would go on this clay form then?
Exactly, yeah. But first, the really important thing is that because before, the skin would go on sort of like a really crappily assembled, just rough mannequin, or you just stuff the skin raw. And in this case, it sounded vulgar. Man. His first revolution is that he creates the undercarriage. He sculpts the animal out of pure clay, and he creates like the tendons and the musculature and everything underneath the skin. You know, that's the thing that is evoking the expression of the animal. Is like, it's not our skin, it's what's underneath our skin, our muscles, etc.
Basically, the big eureka is you kind of just have a skin. You have to have the form underneath the skin in order to enliven the exterior.
Yeah.
Which, but then the clay doesn't work out.
The clay doesn't work out that long.
It's moist.
It's moist, it rots, it's raw, doesn't work well. And let's see, and then there's a few developments. He does a few mounts for the Smithsonian. He's asked to do a few mounts for horses at the 1893 Columbian World's Fair, Commonwealth Exposition. And they kind of go to hell quickly. I mean, they worked fine for it temporarily, but well, actually, it was before that because he said that they were starting to rot. The clay mounts were starting to rot, and then he tried to evolve it by using plaster. So he would use plaster to develop the next stage of the mannequins. They also did not work out well and started to crack and to warp underneath. And then so his kind of like the final vision of the Akeley method. This gets so tedious and boring, it's unbelievable. It's very mechanical, but if you guys want to know, I'll keep going.
Please.
Yeah, all right. So,
I think it's fascinating.
like the initial thing is that he just, he gets the clay sculpture using these and he's already gone to Africa by this point. In 1896, he goes to Somaliland on this expedition, the Field Museum. And so he starts making these, it's about seeing clearly. He makes these observations in the field. He takes thousands, I might be overstating it. He makes many measurements with calipers and steel tape. And I think like there's kind of a small, like an analogy of like the mentality that he had for precision, which was so part of the Industrial Revolution. And just using precision. So it's very mechanical in this way. So he really had, I mean, his images of these animals with all of the coefficients and the measurements were just really ridiculously mechanical looking and interesting. But he would spend a lot of time then taking this animal, going and killing it, collecting it, and then bringing it back to his studio and then recreating it. With all these notes that he'd taken in the field. No one, not so many people have done that before. Yes?
I'm curious, how many pieces is the skin usually in?
I don't know. Mm-hmm. I know, I mean, he did break it up into different pieces, and I remember that, but I don't remember exactly. It would depend on the animal. Like with an elephant, it was many more pieces, and just transporting it back from the field after they would kill an elephant, which was just like a horribly gruesome process, This is where they would have like their whole army of porters, like kind of doing a fire brigade with buckets of salt water and like splashing it on the skin. And yeah, they would chop it up into a bunch of different pieces. It wasn't one skin, maybe something small.
And horrible poisons. I think one of the details that I will unfortunately never forget from this book is the amount of arsenic and the fact that arsenic loosens your fingernails. So all the taxidermists lose their nails like that.
My friend Janelle told me about that.
Crazy.
So gross. Yeah.
Most naturalists and taxidermists also hunters. They would be expected to go and bag the prey.
Akeley became quite the hunter. Yeah. I mean, at first it was very justified, like I'm just going to go do my job.
Right.
And at first, I mean, he went on his first trip for the Field Museum. He seemed to be very reluctant, and his first bag was a Somali wild ass, and I remember he basically just shot it point blank, and he felt very depressed. Yeah, he felt very depressed about it and thought maybe this isn't the job for me. But then he became this kind of Ahab-like character. Especially once he on his second expedition 9 years later in 1905 in British East Africa, and he was hunting elephants and really obsessed with getting the right specimens. He became a little maniacal.
They would shoot elephants and then reject them because they had funny ears.
Yeah.
Just leave them to rot.
Yes.
Was bullet holes like an issue? Like, did they? I don't know, like shoot them in the belly so it would be hidden or something? Like,
They always went for the how to murder an elephant. Good question. They always tried to. They wanted the quickest way to kill it, which was either a. I consulted a lot of hunter people on this so I could understand, because I never understood it. Because in his diaries and these books, he's always talking about, was it 50 yards, was it 100 yards, which means like nothing to me, and I don't watch sports, so I didn't have that analogy. But he always went for a head shot or a straight heart shot. Beyond that, I don't
elephant,
understand.
you don't want to mess around, because if it is going to charge you.
Yeah, it'd kill you.
Yeah.
No, it's very
May as
dangerous.
well just kill it and fix the damage later with epoxy or something. But
Just stitch it up.
I think one thing that's sort of curious, or that's super interesting about sort of the time period that Akeley is working, the idea of nature evolves in such interesting ways. And the story of Jumbo, I wanted to come back to that, because one of the things that is interesting right at the start is in museums you have all these heads in a row and, much more like trophies. But then the other thing that you have is P.T. Barnum and the sort of the freak show aspect. And when Barnum, he's determined to make as much money from Jumbo when Jumbo is dead as he did from Jumbo alive. But when he realizes that taxidermists can make the skin stretch,
Yeah, he didn't, he hadn't quite, later on in his career, he became fanatical in his desire for realism and verisimilitude, which is really interesting, because it's like his work, just to digress for a moment, but while he's doing all of this, and he's creating these dioramas with a really fanatical eye for hardcore realism, like all the other artists around him, Picasso, etc., are kind of going in a totally different direction, where Akeley feels very resentful that he's not being treated as a proper fine artist, but he's really going in a totally opposite direction by trying to go for verisimilitude rather than being interpretive.
Were his observations purely like mathematical, or were they also like impressionistic? Like how much time did he spend trying to capture his observations of how the animals acted? Or?
They were mainly behavioral. Yeah. He was very. one of the I think kind of cool things, despite the fact that he's killing them, and we all, that's always, this is a factor, but he's really intent on capturing the individuality of the animals. So there's almost like an element that seemed evident to me where he's doing for animals what painters during the Renaissance had done for the idea of the individual. Like pre-Renaissance art, painters weren't as concerned with the idea of the individual human being, you know what I mean? And so I think it's really interesting that Akeley's actually doing that with animals. Most people weren't really thinking that way.
In terms of personality, like personality read through the body in terms of...
Yeah, behavioral. The concept of individuality,
It didn't seem like he wanted a true individual, though. He wanted his idealized individual, though. Didn't you say something about him rejecting elephants or having funny-shaped ears?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
He wanted his individuals. But did Renaissance artists just go with like any harlot on the street, or did they have their idealized version of beauty, etc., who were simultaneously, individuals? He had he had his ideal, but he did. But I think I should just say that I feel that he was very informed by this idea that animals had an individuality, and what was it? This was another influence from his friend Wheeler, who I was talking about earlier, who popularized this idea of ecology, who was very big on Darwin, And one of Darwin's books, and I'm totally going to forget the title of it, The Expressions of Humans and Animals, etc., where Darwin had gone to great lengths to kind of collect data from all of the, so-called like primitive cultures all around the world, from all of the anthropologists he could, to show that there was a universality to human expression, and based on like the musculature under our face, that everybody has the same expressions, and Darwin took it to the extent that animals also have that same basic mechanism of expression, where people even today like to continue to think that animals don't have grief, animals don't feel lonely, animals don't have the same emotions we do. Darwin said in 1870 or whatever that they did, that we have, and this was one of the pieces of the puzzle, to say that like humans and animals share the same basic mechanisms of expression, and Akeley took that to be will. And so he's definitely spent a lot of time trying to observe expression in animals, to try to capture them as kind of individuals, which I think is what lends itself toward the kind of what you had never seen before. Even though I had to kill him first.
I think one thing that's interesting about him wanting to be seen as a fine artist, but moving away from the abstraction of where fine art was actually going at the time, is that the other thing that's happening at the time is that photography becomes sort of a mass culture phenomenon, and then moving pictures toward the end of his life, he even invents a type of field camera, right?
He reinvents the motion picture camera, yeah.
And so actually he's moving in that direction in some ways.
It's sort of accidental. It's interesting.
But toward the faithfulness of the camera capture rather than the abstraction of the fine art.
Yeah, and it's one of the real ironies of his story, insofar as something, it's not actually ironic, but it is interesting. May I have some more wine?
When does he die?
He died in 1926 on his last expedition in the Congo. Thank you very much. He was, I can get back to his death in a minute, but maybe I should try to answer your question about the photography element. It's really interesting because, one of the paradoxes that I had a really hard time wrapping my head around, and it's like, okay, well, the thing is like the scientists at the time, like his boss, Henry Fairfield Osborne, who's the president of the American Museum of Natural History, and all of Franz Boas, and all of these real scientists knew that because of the colonization of Africa, that all of these species were doomed to extinction. Like they knew that because of the habitat loss and the psychotic overkilling of these animals. And they'd seen it. They'd seen it in the American West, and so their MO for a while was really like, well, it was very fatalistic. So like, well, these elephants, all these cool animals that these Westerners had not really experienced before, are now on the cusp of extinction. But we're scientists, and so following in the same MO as Linnaeus, of just like collect, catalog, name. Like we need to get voucher species, so the people of the future will see what was there and what was lost. And beyond that, it's not really much more beyond preserving the image of the animal. The idea of actually preserving the life of the species or saving the species, which is now we're like, let's save the mountain gorilla. Let's not just save an image of it. But to me, the more I dug in, I think it's obvious in the end. It's like it really comes down to the technology, because photography is in its infancy. I remember there was one ornithologist association meeting around that time where somebody had taken 200 pictures of a seagull, and it was bragging because one of them, very blurry image, had come across, and he was really proud that he'd gotten one halfway decent image out of 200 images. So the idea of preserving species or the image of species for our knowledge, because that's what humans want, is like, we want to have, where's this information, where's this knowledge? They didn't have that. So the way of preserving images was through taxidermy. And Akeley was kind of the best at that. And so that's what he's doing, he's preserving images. They're called voucher species. Voucher species. Like, this species is going to go extinct. We need to make sure we have a representation of it before it's gone. And actually, like, the first day that he began working on the African, on the Hall of African Mammals on September 1st, 1914 was the day that Martha, the last passenger pigeon in Cincinnati, died. Just a little, like, factoid.
But there's one just sort of comment that you make in the book that I think is super interesting, and I've been thinking about it ever since I read it, where you just compare Akeley and his wife when they're painting individual leaves for one of the dioramas. You compare them to a counterfeiting operation.
Yeah.
And which I think is just a super evocative way of describing it, but it almost made me start thinking about like in Blade Runner, where there's that test, the Voight-Kampff test, where they're testing human beings to see if they're humans or if they're replicants.
Yeah.
Where they're counterfeit, in other words, like it's a counterfeit human being. I guess I'm just curious about that weird line between trying to make something that is, it's like in Blade Runner they say more human than human. In this case, it's more natural than nature, and just sort of that move toward verisimilitude that is so exact that it could actually pass for the real thing, and what that desire is, where you'd actually walk in and see a diorama that looks so much like Africa, it looks like you've sliced it out and stuck it into a museum. I guess I'm just curious about that need to have a kind of a counterfeit nature as opposed to a.
Yeah, I don't know what the need. I'd have to think. I don't know what the need is right off, except this notion that we're about to lose something. And if you think about, let's just do the kind of like follow the money thing for a second. I guess I'm just gonna like riff with it, but there's two things. There's one, I was starting to go in the direction of like where Akeley had actually used the camera as it existed then. So he had like this British bioscope movie camera, which he used as one of his additional tools, in addition to the calipers and the measurements and the sketches. Like, so he actually had a movie camera, that he was using as an instrument, as a tool to make better taxidermy. And then it's during this kind of hiatus during World War I, when he's working on the elephants, that he actually has he starts redesigning the motion picture, the movie camera itself. He totally reinvents the movie camera, and I'll come back to that in a second. But I'll try to go back to this idea, like the verisimilitude, like why. I'm not really sure. Try it. I'm not really sure.
Well, and it's sort of an idealized verisimilitude, which is very interesting. I think there's sort of the perfect moment, which is so curious. The dioramas in the Akeley Hall of African Mammals, they know the spot where they were painted from, and they've actually, current curators have gone and visited them, and there are markers, but yet they're still idealized, like they're slightly improved.
I think that, that the idea of counterfeiting, I'm kind of fairly obsessed with that notion in general. It's like copies, and I think it was just an idea at the time, like that was the kind of ideal of art in his mind, which was like, if I can reproduce it perfectly, then that would be the best possible performance of his art. Even at the same time, like I know that Wheeler, now I'm gonna go off the tracks a little bit. Wheeler was reading to him when I said his friend Wheeler would read to him a lot, try to educate him, and he was reading to him like Schopenhauer. Yeah. Who I don't have like a huge understanding of, but like I know like one of the basic ideas of Schopenhauer is like the more you intently try to capture reality, the more doomed you are to distort it. So I thought it was kind of interesting that Akeley was, I don't know. Yeah.
In terms of natural simulations, this is where the counterfeiting thing is perplexing to me, because I feel like nature doesn't use an intellectual system to create itself. It's not using a comprehensive system or a comprehension system to sort of create it. And And sort of in natural simulations, I mean, like I almost love the corniness of like, you know, at the, you know, there's the Lincoln Plaza Cinemas on the Upper West Side where if you go down to the lobby, there's like a little greenery with like a waterfall, and like it's so cheesy and it's so obviously done. They're not necessarily trying to, you know, make a replica of like an actual natural system. But in the cases where they are, like, I'm curious, was there any space for him to like, you know, actually not have an intellectual system in terms of like making, you know, an exact replica, an exact copy? Because like, just like using those words doesn't really seem like, at least to me, the most suitable mode to like enter into that space of what a natural simulation would be, what a simulation of how a bear stands would be. Like moving actually out of the human perception of that into a different space, an animal perception of that, or a vegetable perception of that.
I don't know. I mean, sometimes I have like these crazy ideas where I think it would be pretty funny to like imagine like a diorama where it's like you have, you know, where they worked on this one of his first real breakthrough pieces called the Four Seasons, which he was kind of working on in secret in Chicago.
That was him.
In Chicago, yeah, and the Field Museum, the deer. Yeah, it's Akeley's. That's one of his first real breakthrough pieces. He worked on it forever. He and his wife, his child bride, Mickey, worked on it intensely. And like, I mean, that comes into the verisimilitude a little bit, where he was sending her up on her own to the northern woods of Wisconsin to take samples of lichen and dirt and leaves, and then taking plaster molds of leaves of trees, but like, you know, 6 different molds of the leaves, different sizes, and then she's back and working in her studio recreating the foliage, and she ended up making like 30,000 leaves, like cutting out the cotton batting, you know, this lemon, you know, kind of like you know, like a lemon vice thing, yeah. And Akeley, it was a recreation of the 4 seasons: so summer, winter, spring, and fall. So the concept being 4 deer in different stages of the seasons, obviously represented by 16 individual deer, which I think is like such a strange distortion, you know. But I have like these kind of weird surreal visions of it being like, wouldn't it be interesting if, you know, you had it like this just perfect verisimilitude, but then maybe in the corner there would be like, you know, like one of the big giant skinning blades just leaning against something, or I don't know, or a deer kind of half done. But that's just me. And now, I mean, it's really interesting now because there's, I don't know if any of you are like familiar with like the Minnesota Association of Rogue Taxidermists, and there's a real big trend now, kind of like surrealist taxidermy. And they're doing it very consciously and talking about like using Salvador Dali's manifesto about irrationality, and it's awesome, you know. But they're not killing, and they're taking like roadkill and stuff, and then doing extremely surreal things with these animals. But it's very informed. It's very informed in that way. But you know, I mean, at that time, I mean, he's kind of, you know, he's sort of behind the times, I guess, as an artist, you know. But on the other hand, I don't think he's even aware of what you know, what the Armory show, and so he's not thinking about stuff like that.
I think it's really, really interesting how taxidermy is sort of behind the times and forgotten as an art form. You know, it says something very profound about our relationship with animals and how we want to think about it. But I think that, and I think actually what is the one of the things that really I appreciate about the book is that Akeley obviously has an amazing life story. I mean, you only have to read this. There's the child bride, there's his episodes of malaria, there are these expeditions to Africa, there's all sorts of insanity in his life, which is fascinating. And you could just stop with the story of Akeley. I mean, that's a story in and of itself. But what you also do is you use Akeley as a lens to look at all of these kind of ideas of nature that are swirling around. And one thing that I thought was sort of curious, you spent some time talking about the Museum of Natural History and how how that functioned in a New York that was filling up with immigrants. And that's very interesting. And so I would like to ask about that. And also, what is also happening, and this is also interesting for students of, how nature fits into the city, is that Central Park dates to 1857, which is, again, sort of roughly the same time period. So there's, again, sort of a constructed view of nature there. So, and that's something you talk about in here. So I'm sort of interested in how those two things, those ideas of nature and using Akeley as a sort of lens.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, to me, that was certainly, that was like one of the most disturbing aspects of it. And you're kind of, like digging in and seeing like, well, what are the motivations behind his employers, at the museum. So Akeley himself isn't, he's not an intellectual, like these ideas that we're throwing out, he's not thinking that much about ecology. He's kind of being pushed by his... Whoa. Wow.
Sorry about that.
Wow.
Nice with the studio.
Yeah, but so even if Akeley didn't have, there's all this racial stuff that's going on and that's very heavy, but that there's people kind of behind the scenes who do have very deliberate, conscious ideas about what this all means. And one of them being his boss at the AMNH, the American Museum of Natural History, Henry Fairfield Osborne. It's kind of phenomenal. He's if you don't know, he's kind of a famed eugenicist, and he was a huge fan of Akeley's, and he recruited Akeley from the Field Museum to come to New York. And he referred to him as Phidias. Phidias being that great Greek sculptor who had done like these giant sculptures of Zeus and Athena at the Parthenon, and he's kind of like put him on that level. He brings him to New York, sends him to Africa, but it's complicated. It's distorted because he also he's really heavily invested in the concept of human origins. Okay, and so I'm forgetting this name. I think doesn't matter, but because the question of human origins was such a big deal at that point, Osborne had really put himself out there by saying, "There's no way it's Africa." The missing link, that's the last place it's going to be. And his reasoning for this is just pure 1905 racism, which is that his idea was that, he believed in evolution, but he only believed in it to a degree. So he didn't believe in the idea of random mutations. He believed in the idea of predestined mutations. And he believed that it had to be a forward, moving kind of, that it was moral. He was always trying to make an argument for the morality of evolution. So he couldn't accept random evolution. He couldn't accept the idea that we'd all come from like a common ancestor. And so he believed in what was called at the time parallel evolution. So the different races had come from, we'd all evolved, but the Poles had come this way and the Anglos had come this way and Africans, it was parallel, not touching. And so he didn't believe that the Dawn Man would be found in Africa. And his reason behind this was that he believed that the Nordic, Aryan, and I can't remember what else, whatever, like the Northern European folk had really suffered and struggled. And this idea of struggle and striving then is like such a phenomenally kind compelling idea from a lot of thinkers, a lot of white male thinkers. So like Teddy Roosevelt really believed in this. And you hear anything about TR, it's always about striving and fighting, striving, fighting, striving, fighting. And so they thought, well, because the Aryans and Nordics and Northern European white folk had to strive against the cold, that it had been so much more difficult to grow up there rather than like, lazy, luxurious Africa, that there's no way that the Don man could come from Africa. Okay, so that's kind of like the evolutionary, like, fucked up background. And, all right, and so, where do I go with this?
Well, so meanwhile, New York as a city is filled with immigrants. Like this is a period in history where America is changing from a country that has a lot of wilderness, where people can go out and prove their manhood and struggle effectively, and then also a place that is area and
so like this is like during the peak of the immigrant phase in New York. So there's 2 million people coming in a year, and Henry Fairfield Osborne is part of the aristocracy of New York. So if you think about it, this is just amazing to think about, because Henry Fairfield Osborne, Teddy Roosevelt's father, was one of the original founders of the American Museum of Natural History. And all of the trustees, like J.P. Morgan, the Colgates, the Dodges, like all of the captains of industries, brokers, and railroad tycoons, and these guys whose specialty is basically acquisition, right? And they are petrified of the idea of all of these, the unwashed masses, the huddled, the hordes coming in. They're terrified of this, and like they're so naked about it that they're constantly writing these op-eds in the New York Times and Science Journal and Outlook and Collier's and stuff like this about race suicide. They're terrified that if like the upper class, if the aristocracy doesn't procreate enough, that they're going to be wiped out. So, they basically just hate the idea of the melting pot. He's always ranting against the melting pot. He says, if you combine the races, you're just as apt to combine the vices as much as the virtues. And so, but this guy runs the museum. And so he kind of has this twofold ambition for bringing people in. One is to this kind of urban idea to placate people from the poisons of the Industrial Revolution and becoming over-civilized. That's a terror for like Teddy Roosevelt and all these people. Like the idea of becoming over-civilized is like really would weaken everybody. But it's also, so it's like to bring people in, get a dose of nature and kind of be a healing spiritual thing. But it's also to bring in the immigrants and to show them that there are these divisions between species, and please don't miscegenate. And that's just, it's plain as day that that's what they're up to.
So even though Akeley, I feel, at least you feel, doesn't sort of believe those things, the dioramas exist in this world where they're like part medicine for the, for the American spirit to provide enough struggle or wilderness. And then they're part didactic, so, don't mix. And then I feel like they're also part sort of emerging idea of like leisure. And what do these urban people who work in the city do in their free time? We must provide for that, so it is spent suitably,
Yeah, there's this real, even like people as different as Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir, who has, who's like, Teddy Roosevelt is such an amazing character. He's a conservationist, but his main thinking is that he's seen, there's always been this idea in America that natural resources are infinite, and the idea that God would create things that would then disappear didn't really exist in people's minds. And so Teddy Roosevelt is sort of realizing like, oh, there's the closing of the frontier in the 1880s, and shit, that like we might run out of these resources. And he embodies the idea of expanding American power. He's like the original imperialist. He wants to expand our markets worldwide, and he knows. So when he's talking about conservation, it's the idea of like we need to have these resources so we can continue being like a major power and to fuel our expansion, which also has like an interesting parallel in if you look at where the American Museum of Natural History is going on a lot of its expeditions and collecting. They're going perfectly in tandem with where American imperial market interests are going. It's amazing. And Henry Fairfield Osborne, the president, he speaks quite nakedly in terms of these collecting expositions being conquests. So there's that. But Roosevelt and John Muir, who was more of a transcendentalist and kind of like pure nature for nature's sake, they had similar philosophies, but I think like Roosevelt looked at people like John Muir and thought, he called them goo-goos. Like hippies, basically.
I'm curious as to how your speaking about plays into the existence of the sculpture outside of the American Museum of Natural History.
Of him on the horse with the Indians?
Yeah. On a lower,
kind of speaks for itself, doesn't it?
Yeah, and also it kind of speaks to that idea of like showing immigrants that species are separate. I mean, in some like
this shows that
racial way.
Oh, no, Roosevelt was naked in those beliefs.
Of that.
No, he was, he believed very strongly in that idea that we need to civilize the savages.
And I'm also just interested in hearing if you know anything about the continual politics of that sculpture, because every time I see it, I just
freak out.
A little bit.
I don't. No, it's not something I followed, but I'd be really interested in. Have you?
No, I mean I hadn't actively thought about it except when
you could see that being a hot spot for people like bring it down.
Though.
No, of course not. People just like walk past stuff like that all the time. But I mean, there's like every block of America has something like that on it.
It's really terrifying. Sorry.
No, that's good. The New England section at the American Museum of Natural History, did that come much later in that case? It's right next to the whale room. It's pretty much just like, just in the sense that you're talking about, it seems at least be in a different sort of world than necessarily like racial differentiation or just like local pride, love your New England landscape sort of thing.
The New England section at the end.
There's like a huge spread.
I don't have the beat on that, man. Sorry, I don't know.
So the dioramas
Is it like lobsters and?
Yeah, no. I wish there's actually just some actually really beautiful dioramas there. Also more along the lines of the Conservancy. There's one. There's a Pepper's Ghost with sort of a forest fire Pepper's Ghost where there's like a huntsman in the woods, and then the mirrors change and it's like a woods burned down fire, which is like one of the great pieces. And there's also some great diorama, some also great dioramas of just like natural landscapes and earthworms under the ground, sort of thing.
Yeah.
It's actually my favorite section.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
Really?
There's a lot of wood paneling in that room. It feels like in the 70s.
Oh, it's very much like 70s decor. It's so cool. Yeah.
I have to,
There's like usually like chairs and dust gathering in the Pepper's Ghost, though. It's like, we don't,
So the dioramas we see now are his, and when did he do them?
well, he died in 1926 in the Congo, trying to get. He actually bringing a small army of painters with him who did those phenomenal background paintings. And he died of approximately 15 different causes.
And nobody's talked about changing it since 1926.
Well, they actually, it was his, it was his concept. He first had the idea in 1911. He was there. He'd convinced Teddy Roosevelt to go there after his second term. And then he was kind of into his full Ahab mode. And like dishing elephants left and right because they had like one tusk wasn't as long as the whole thing. And he ended up, he was really looking for his big bull, like the central bull of that main, what's it called, the alarm, that elephant herd that you see when you walk into the stampede. Yeah. And he just like, he spent like a year actually over there after Teddy Roosevelt left, trying to track down the perfect specimen. And he went up Mount Kenya, and he got poleaxed by a bull that like almost killed him. It came out of nowhere, and it's like this ridiculous story, really, where it was kind of like a tusk appeared in his chest out of nowhere. He grabbed the tusk, he got between the tusk, he got the other tusk, he was riding the elephant's face like a bicycle. You could see like its eyeball right in his face kind of thing. And then it rammed him into the ground, and it like tore off his cheek and scalped him and broke a bunch of ribs, etc. And then instead of going back to America to a hospital, he convalesced in a tent for 3 months while his wife Nikki took over management of the safari. And it was during that period he was very feverish and weird and delirious, and he started having visions of what would ultimately become the American, this African hall. It was like this cinematic room. We'd walk in, it would be dark, and there'd be like, you'd look in a window, and there'd be like a scene of geronix, and then in one baboons, and what it is today. So that was a big time hallucination.
So you're walking into someone else's hallucination at today's Natural History Museum.
Oh yeah, it was a very altered thing. And I don't know what my point was after that, but that's how he came up with that idea.
But then, since 26, no one said,
oh, right.
You need to upgrade.
Well, he came up with a vision. He brought it back, and Osborne quickly was like, this is great, let's do this. And then World War I, and then he divorced his wife. He almost killed her. He tried to cut her throat and gas her. And then there was a lot of whoring around, and then a lot of laziness, a lot of not finishing his work. I mean, he's not, I love Akeley, but he's kind of an anti-hero. And then he finally gets around to working on it again. He goes and collects the mountain gorillas. He kills some. He has a great redemption story where he realizes, oh, what I'm doing is wrong. And then he creates the first sanctuary in Africa and basically saves the mountain gorilla. I mean, Diane Fossey, said like if it weren't for Akeley, the mountain gorilla would have been extinct. But then, it's like huge. It was a huge project. So he was dead for 10 years by the time they finished. His apprentice, James L. Clark, kind of stepped in the museum. They moved on in 1936. It was the first opening to the public when they'd finished, and they hadn't even finished all of the dioramas by that point. And it was a huge, 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 huge thing.
I mean, I think what's interesting is that diorama technology, as far as I can tell, hasn't even moved on that much since then. And we had a couple of weeks ago, the week before last, I think?
Yeah,
2 weeks ago, we had a guy called George Dante come speak here, he owns a company called Wildlife Preservations, which is based in Jersey, and they did all the installations, the rock work, and the taxidermy and whatnot for the American Museum of Natural History's Darwin show, for example. And he's using things that Akeley invented, like shotcrete, like the concrete gun, all of these are things that Akeley invented. There's also some auto body epoxy type resins that he uses that are newer, but it's a lot. It was amazing how much technology hadn't moved on. And one of the things I'm curious about is your research process, because you did go and spend some time with a contemporary taxidermist / rock work.
I didn't really spend an enormous amount of time with taxidermists.
But Janelle,
it's nice to read about them to experience firsthand. I paid my dues. I went and I hung out with the Schwenneman brothers, who are the guys who do They're kind of like the top end dudes who do the restorations at the museum now. If like the elephant needs like new
It's a lot of maintenance.
hair or whatever. And so I went there, and they were clearly like testing me, you know, like they were working on something. They were like ancient. They were really ancient individuals. And they were like the dad was working on like a badger or something, I don't remember what it was. And at lunchtime, they're like, well, I offered to go get lunch. They're like, yeah, go across the street. So I went and got like these, hoagies or sandwiches or whatever you call them, and brought them back. And like, I remember they like mopped up the table from the blood and the badger they'd been like excavating. They're like, well, is she here? And I kind of like knew, I was like, they don't eat here. It's like, they're just doing this to like, play with me.
They're hazing you.
They were hazing me. But like my main source was this guy named John Ginelli. He's just like a great guy. And he's in Jersey City, and he's this very high decibel individual. And he's obsessed with Carl Akeley. And he always, he's just such a great guy. He always had these like really wild ideas to help me understand the Akeley method. And so one of the best ones was that there was an elephant at a petting zoo, and this is horrible, but there was an elephant at a petting zoo in Florida. And John was like, they want me to come down there and like euthanize it. And I'll bring it back on a flatbed truck, and we'll bring it to Jersey in like in a barn, and you and me we'll hire like 20 people to help us, and we'll strip it out just like the Akeley method. And that didn't materialize.
Thank goodness.
Yeah, it's kind of a thank goodness moment.
Yeah.
I didn't really, because there's enough to read about, and I wasn't like that interested.
Was Akeley at all in touch with other people around the world who also, if you go to Sweden, the Swedes will tell you they invented the diorama.
Oh, the Karen Wonders thing, right? Yeah. You read Karen Wonders.
Was he in touch with other people in Northern Europe, etc.? Not at all.
I don't know. You're talking about Karen Wonders' research between Sweden and the United States, and I'm very aware of that, but...
in Sweden at the biology museum.
I don't know if it was...
They have these dioramas from the 19th century, which says straight up right there, these are the first dioramas in the world. And I was wondering to what extent, even if, who cares who was first, but there's a lot of stuff going on in Northern Europe around the same time, around the same issues of how to represent nature, and I was wondering if he was in touch with them at all.
Yeah, honestly, I don't know. Not that I know. I feel like I read like all of his correspondence, and I don't remember. I read Karen Wonders.
Tried to hire him, right?
Yeah, he was on his way to England in 1894 when the Field Museum got a hold of him. But as far as Sweden, I know what you're talking about, and that's just honestly something I don't know much about. I don't know if it was kind of simultaneous, which would make sense because like a lot of these things, developments like this often happen simultaneously. So, but in terms of communication, I don't remember ever seeing any correspondence between them.
I think that's one of the interesting things, almost, is just Akeley becomes this sort of just a focal point for all of the ideas of nature that are swirling around. Like the available technologies, the scramble for Africa, all of the European nations sort of carving up Africa, and the idea of America having this kind of, maybe it will be an imperial power, and it's sending off people to bag the mammals of Africa, and I think that's what makes this more than just like the stories of a person who is kind of amazingly weird and interesting, because it's kind of all of these forces are swirling around. We're creating Central Park on the one hand, so that there's like this idea of a landscape there, and then there are all the immigrants on the other hand, and ideas of eugenics, and voices. Like all of these ideas are swirling around at the same time, and Akeley manages to sort of act as a...
Sometimes I feel like Akeley is almost inadvertently, unwittingly creating these allegories for what's happening socially and geopolitically. There's this idea of partitions, the idea of colonization, the idea of eugenics, and then the idea of preservation. I mean, like, kind of at the heart of everything is about preservation. And so, I was talking briefly about the kind of social anxieties of the aristocracy of New York, who are all on the trustees of of these natural history museums. Their main obsession is really about preserving themselves, preserving their class, because they really feel in the face of this onslaught of these immigrants coming in miscegenation, that they're going to be wiped out. They really sincerely believe that. It's very bizarre. I mean, like Teddy Roosevelt wrote a number of op-eds and essays called like the threat of race suicide. If we don't propagate enough, we're going to be victims of race suicide. We'll lose our edge. So I feel like, in a sense, like Akeley somehow, like almost like creating these like allegories for their fears of preserving themselves and their fears that they themselves might go extinct. And if you look at what's, the other really big thing that's taking place in these natural history museums, and the thing that brings in the public in droves are the dinosaurs. And the dinosaur skeletons are a huge symbol for this relatively new idea of extinction. I mean, it's not until, that's not an idea that went down. Thomas Jefferson was like a big naturalist. When he sent out Lewis and Clark, he was like, find me some mastodons, because we found these skeletons. Like, there's got to be these weird prehistoric creatures out there in the West. Go find those. And then the idea of species going extinct is totally unacceptable theologically. Like, the idea that God would create a species that would go extinct is insane to these people.
Very
wasteful. And then, when it does kind of kick in, I know I'm being a little, maybe overly interpreting, but I felt like, like the dinosaurs were like the aristocracy of the Mesozoic, and like these New York like trustees were like, yeah, that could be us. I don't know.
Do you have a favorite Akeley diorama?
I like this one with the gorilla.
Okay.
I think that's cool. I like the gorilla. I like the gorilla one. Yeah.
It's a great girl.
If you ever go to Sweden, there's in Gothenburg, there is a whale that they stuffed. It's the only stuffed blue whale in the world.
Wow.
Do you know about this whale?
No.
It's got they're sort of articulated with a jaw, and you can walk in, and there's a tea room in the middle of the
tea room?
Yes.
You can have a cup of tea.
In its mouth?
No, all the way in its belly.
Wow.
The tea room. And for the
That's
100th anniversary,
amazing.
it's an amazing thing. It's the 100th anniversary of the whale in the 1960s. Two kinds of people showed up for this anniversary, including a lot of evangelists from the United States. There are amazing photographs. Yeah, the Jonah the Whale sort of, mythology was triggered full time for the 100th anniversary. There are amazing photographs inside this tea room with people praying in there while other people are kind of having tea. It's a kind of crazy thing.
That's amazing.
There's a book about it called The Gothenburg Whale.
Really?
Yeah. It's Gothenburg Leviathan or something.
Wow.
I think I remember the first dinosaur exhibit, like that crystal. What was it? Where they were unveiled at the Crystal Palace, but maybe that's what it was. But you could actually get inside the dinosaurs. I remember seeing like some guys just sort of sitting around the table. It was like sort of carved out in the center.
This is the one in England.
It's a phenomenon.
Hawkins' dinosaurs, right?
What's that?
Hawkins' dinosaurs is the guy who made it.
Yeah.
Wow. Well,
Just quickly.
one final, but then we'll,
If you got any special access to the museum, did you get to see anything interesting that we don't see?
I spent an enormous amount of time in their archives, but I didn't get any. They didn't like take the glass panes off the dioramas for me.
You didn't step inside.
Really
Are there back
really wanted
doors
to do
into
that.
those? Do they like have to
I
go
don't
in?
know. They never let me in.
To clean them. I mean,
I know, like a year before I started working on it, they had done some sort of restoration. I remember like a New York Times reporter got inside, and I'm still really jealous. But no, I never got inside.
okay.
Well, I will say one thing you do to clean taxidermy animals is there's like a vacuum cleaner that's a backpack and you vacuum the dust off the animals. But anyway.
Do you work with them?
I did that once, but I have a question for you, which is how did you become so involved in this historical figure?
It was really serendipitous. It was by accident. I was working on a story for Harper's about an invisible mammal, the eastern mountain lion, which went extinct in 1888. And it was just totally by accident that I was writing about that. There's sightings of it all the time in the east. It's kind of like Elvis sightings, you know?
Elvis and the Eastern Mountain Lion hanging out together
Totally.
in the Appalachians.
And so I started research. It was just like the most mind-blowing thing.
Well, because Akeley strangled a mountain lion, is that the deal?
No. He strangled a leopard.
Okay.
Jesus.
I was strangling a leopard and a mountain lion.
no,
It's somewhat parallel in my mind.
But Teddy Roosevelt stabbed a mountain lion in the heart. He jumped and like stabbed. So you're probably confusing those two like equally heroic stories. Yeah, it was just by accident. I mean, I was reading about, and I was kind of reading about the history of the kind of genocide, basically, that was levied against, like wolves and mountain lions and these animals that farmers and ranchers thought were demons. And I just read something in passing about Akeley, like in my random research, and it was detail about the famous taxidermist who once like strangled a leopard with his bare hands. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And I started reading about him, and then I thought, there's a book.
All right, here's a book. On that happy note, here is a book. It's also right there. And if you have any more questions or would like to get a copy signed or whatever, feel free to hang out. I'm not closing this down. I'm more just saying now we become even more informal.
I'd be happy to keep
just chat.
chatting.
So
Yeah.
keep asking questions. We're all good. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.